Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the first of the Race and in America series. My name is Richard Locke, and I'm a professor of political science and international public affairs here at Brown, and I currently serve as the provost. And I'm pleased to be a co-sponsor of this series because, to my mind, there is no more pressing issue right now requiring thoughtful, concerted, and substantial attention than addressing systemic racism in the United States. Racism, and especially anti-Black racism, is literally centuries in the making. And while there have been junctures where, through the good work, perseverance, and persistence of activists and scholars, policymakers, and enlightened citizens, we seem to have made some strides towards equity and justice. These last few years offer sobering, steady reminders of just how much work we require to do in our country to be a truly inclusive, healthy, and just nation. And this has become intensely apparent this summer, where we have witnessed repeatedly chilling incidences of anti-Black racism and police violence throughout the US, and in response, civil unrest and demands for justice. Now, institutions of higher education are essential at this moment, and Brown in particular has the privilege and the responsibility to be a force for necessary change. Through our research and teaching, we can and must be an agent for advancing knowledge and promoting social change. This series is just one response that the university is engaging in and is intended to bring our scholarly resources to bear to elevate knowledge and awareness around the origins and enduring legacies of anti-Black racism in the United States. And through this series, we hope to promote the kind of meaningful discussion around race, racism, bias, and justice that needs to happen on and beyond our campus. I'm very grateful to Professor Tricia Rose and her CSREA colleagues for her work in curating the series, which will continue throughout the academic year. And we are very fortunate to have so many exceptional scholars at Brown who can lend their expertise on areas ranging from race and punishment, race and democracy, race and public health, and race and social movements to lift and challenge our thinking. With race and slavery, we begin the series with a crucial topic essential to our framework moving forward. Many thanks to our panelists, Professor Tony Bogues, Emily Owens, and Seth Rockman for taking the time today to be part of this talk and to launch our series. I'll now turn things over to Professor Tricia Rose, and I hope that everyone registered today will take part in future events as well. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much, Provost Locke, for your opening remarks and for your collaboration on this important conversation series for our campus. Before donning my moderator hat, I want to offer a few brief comments and extend some genuine thank yous to the many people who were critical for making this possible. The staff at CSREA is remarkable, and I'm very grateful to them for all they do behind the scenes to make sure events appear seamless and flawless. I also want to thank Meg Silvestri and the University Communications team, Media Services, and Events teams for their expert help in professional planning. And special thanks to Marissa Quinn, Chief of Staff in the Provost's office, as always, for her vision, support, and grace under pressure. I also really want to offer a heartfelt thank you to all of the faculty members who agreed to participate in this series and share their reflections, insights, and wisdom. Without their brilliance and commitment, this series would have been entirely impossible. And in keeping with the spirit that so often defines our community at Brown, everyone responded quickly and affirmatively. As impressive as this participant list is, I know, too, that it does not represent an exhaustive list of our faculty research and teaching talent on race. I hope we can expand and continue this series in the months and years ahead beyond this academic year, as there are many more race ands to be developed, race and politics, race and immigration, race and education, just to name a few. It's exceptionally important that we prioritize an informed, thoughtful, and frank conversation about race in America now. It's a profoundly significant and defining characteristic of the US and a definitive force in the world. It has always been disappointing to me how little we talk about race in a serious and meaningful way in this country, in the kind of way that requires and forces us to consider change. That said, I've also been deeply inspired recently by how students and scholars and many others from all walks of life have stepped up to support those who've been yelling into the wind about the depths of systemic racism and the crisis of policing Black and brown communities. The murder of George Floyd appears to have become a tipping point in our society and around the world. What could have easily been yet another incident with sadness and frustration and some short-lived protest of only a relative few instead has become a profound movement where people of all backgrounds appear to be finally willing to say, enough is enough. Despite this outpouring, the depths and the complexity of anti-Black racism needs examination and exposure. And this conversation series is aimed at providing both. Our hopes here are to contribute to this important conversation by gathering our expert colleagues to help advance our collective conversation and our communal knowledge. And so we begin with slavery. Race in the US is profoundly shaped by slavery. It could hardly be more significant. And today we are very fortunate to have three brilliant, dedicated speakers who will each share their reflections and comments for about 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes, and this will be followed by discussion amongst the panelists and with the audience. The framing questions for this particular event are as follows. The transatlantic slave trade and the enslavement of Africans was a formative and foundational part of the emergence of race, racial hierarchy, and the shaping of the US. What aspects of this history do you think, based on your own work, if you wish, is among the most relevant in continuing to shape the lives of people of African descent and the broader society today? Our speakers will speak in the order that I will read their bios now in that same order. Our first speaker will be Professor Tony Bogues, who's the Asa Messer Professor of Humanities and Critical Theory, Professor of Africana Studies, and Director for the Center of the Study of Slavery and Justice. Professor Bogues is a writer, scholar, curator, and director of CSSJ. His major research and writing interests are intellectual, literary, and cultural history, radical political thought, political theory, Caribbean and African politics, as well as Haitian, Caribbean, and African art. In addition to his many writings on the global history of political thought, he's the editor of After Man, Towards the Human, critical essays on Sylvia Wynter, the George Lamming Reader, and Metamorphosis, the art of Edouard Duval-Carré, and curator of numerous art shows. Seth Rockman is an associate professor of history, and Professor Rockman is born in Indiana and raised in San Francisco. He received his BA in Columbia University, completed his PhD at the University of California, Davis, and after several years on the faculty of Occidental College in Los Angeles, Professor Rockman joined the Department of History at Brown in 2004. His 2009 book, Scraping By, Wage, Labor, Slavery, and Survival in Early Baltimore, in 2009, won an OAH, the Organization of American Historians, Merle Curti Prize, and the Philip Taft Labor History Book Award, and the H.L. Mitchell Prize from the Southern Historical Association. Rockman and Beckert co-edited Slavery's Capitalism, A New History of American Economic Development from 2016. And Rockman spent the 16-17 academic year at an organization, a research institute called Rework, a research institute on global label history at the Humboldt University in Berlin. And our final speaker this afternoon is Professor Emily Owens, who's an assistant professor of history and works on the history of sexuality and slavery. Her current book project, Fantasies of Consent, Sex, Affect, and Commerce in 19th Century New Orleans, is a cultural and legal history of the sex trade in antebellum New Orleans. This project explores the lives of women of color who sold or were sold for sex in that market, as well as the legal, economic, and affective structures that determined much of their existence. Owens has received support from the Library Company of Philadelphia, the Charles Warren Center for American History, and the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship. In addition to her appointment in the Department of History at Brown, Owens also joins the Center for Slavery and Justice as a faculty member. Thank you all very much for joining us. I now turn it over to Professor Tony Bogues.
Thank you very much, Professor Rose. I want to thank Professor Rose and Provost Locke for inviting me to speak on this forum. In my brief remarks, I want to state 3 propositions and then make one provocation. It's connected to the title I am working through and circling around, called Race, Slavery, the Making of the Modern World, Deposits, Structures, and Ways of Life. Proposition 1, racial slavery and the dispossession of the indigenous population and their genocide are the foundations of America, the Americas, the New World, and the modern world. Why? The Americas, Latin America, United States, and the Caribbean were founded as settler colonies. All of these colonies were founded as part of the settler colonialism of the European colonial project, opened up by the 15th century, late 15th century voyage of Columbus. This colonial project, British, French, Spanish, Dutch, and others, was not just about a certain kind of political economy of extraction or disposition that is around what was then called empty lands, but rather also involved the creation of a set of human hierarchies, a certain kind of human classificatory system. Human societies not only operate through the mechanisms of the economy, but we create as human beings stories, narratives, and discourses about what we are doing. Stories which when once told, then and become congealed, then become the material realities of our society. The Caribbean theorist Sylvia Wynter puts it well when she makes the point that as humans, we are also narrative beings. So what were the elements of the stories, of the discourses about the human classificatory systems formed in the inauguration of the European colonial project? Firstly, there was a story and a discourse that tried to answer the question of who and what were the Native Americans in the colonial encounter. Did they have souls or not? Because if they did, then they could not be placed in slavery and in other forms of servitude. The philosopher and theologian Francisco Victoria answered this question very clearly in Spain in the discussion and debates about the rights and dispossession of the indigenous population, when he made the remark that the indigenous population were, in his words, barbarians and slaves. This was very important because this argument was important because it also was about whether or not the indigenous populations could be considered what was then called natural man. The second discourse and second set of stories that were told in this schema of human classificatory really were related to the Africans themselves. And here there was not much difficulty, quite frankly, because in European colonialism, one of the things that stood out was who was human and who wasn't. And for the Europeans, colonialism, to be human was to be a Christian. And therefore, since Africans were not Christians, but many of them were primarily Muslims or were practitioners of African religions, then many in Europe felt that they were quote unquote heathen and therefore could be enslaved. This is therefore of enslaving the Africans, which began primarily on religious ground, which was really to cover a problem of labor, was also then complicated by the idea that the African was a natural slave, drawing particularly from the work of Aristotle, Aristotle's conception of what was a natural slave. If you read carefully the actual documents of pro-slavery documents in America, right up to the Civil War period, one of the things that you will see are the ways in which the deployment of Aristotle's notion of a natural slave was used by pro-slave thinkers and ideologists and by planters to justify African slavery. So this particular system of human classification of the African slave as non-human and of race could be exemplified in the colonial period by when one looks at, say, for example, in Saint-Domingue in French colonialism, there were 128 shades of people being human, or in Mexico under Spanish colonialism, when the Casta paintings became the foundation for thinking about questions of race and color. All of this was reorganized and reworked in the United States, because if you remember, US was a colony. It was at first a British colony primarily. And so what this meant over time was that enslavement was organized around anti-Black racism. To be Black was to be a slave, to be enslaved was to be Black. This leads me to my second proposition. The Atlantic slavery, plantation slavery in America and in the Americas, was a distinctive form of human domination. It was slavery based upon race, not an ethnic group, not slavery based only upon religion, but increasingly became a certain kind of slavery based upon phenotype. This led to a certain visual grammar of race, a visual grammar of race which then congealed into anti-Black racism. This visual grammar has become not just an ideology, but operates like a fantasy and oftentimes like naturalized common sense, where the Black body is invested with certain characteristics. So therefore, to see the Black body is already to know something about that body, to know the possibilities of that body, and to know what that body will do or will not do. My third proposition is this. Racial slavery was a social system which was born in violence and which required violence for its maintenance. It was also a system, therefore, that was not just sustained by violence, but was generative of violence. And this violence was not personal violence only, it was a violence of the state, and it was a violence of the law and custom. It was also the violence of individual planter power on the plantations. But this generative violence was, according to Saidiya Hartman's work, was productive. And it was productive because it created other things. So it wasn't just a violence that crushed, it was a violence that actually produced certain things. And one of the things it produced was a certain kind of understanding of order and the need for order and the relationship of order to this business of violence. It was also a violence that produced commodification. What the Caribbean historian Escobar said created the property in the person, and created this property in person two ways. Created a double commodification, both for the male slave, and what I've argued, a triple commodification for the female slave, because through sexual violence and rape, the female slave had to produce another enslaved body. All of this particular understanding of violence and slavery has been called by Aimé Césaire, the poet, the process of thingification. My overarching question, therefore, when one thinks about this, the founding of a society on racial slavery and violence, is that when, as James Baldwin says, as humans, we actually carry history through our bodies, what kind of historical deposits are carried forward? What structures of the present are organized around and reflect the histories that I have spoken about? And let me put this another way. What happens when the past is not the past? Or can the past ever be the past if we do not confront it, seek to change the present and therefore the future? And let me put this on one, put it another way, which many people might find more acceptable, but which I think is important, is how can history become a catalyst for change and transformation? My final point is the provocation. What happens when hundreds of years of anti-Black racism as a material practice that shapes American life, a practice that we agree is grounded in violence? What happens when this anti-Black racism continues to regulate behavior? What happens when that, as something born in violence, or as a feature born in violence and generative in violence? And here I want to have a capacious understanding of violence, not just a question of physical harm, but social harm, ways in which people are discriminated against, the way public schools operate, and so on. So what happens when these kind of harms, both physical and social, are actually part of life? What happens when these harms regularly reduce the life chances of Black people in the present? What happens when all of these things occur? We might want to ask the question, is this kind of violence not some kind of state of war? Felicia Donner, who's an Africana Studies PhD student, in her forthcoming thesis titled At the Vanishing Point of the Word, Blackness, Imperium, and the Unnameable War, attempts to explore this position. I do not want to state this particular position, a state of war, as something that is definitive. But what I want to say is that when someone is shot several times in the back, at close range, or when a mentally challenged human being is placed under lockdown with a hood, then I have to reach for, I think, a way to begin to think about this practice, not as anti-Black racism, yes, but also what does the practice signify? And I think that what the practice may signify is the business of an enemy in war. And when one begins to think about the definition of enemy as defined in the early 20th century, and defined as in this way, that an enemy is especially a certain kind of existential, different and alien being who can in certain conditions and conflicts be treated in a certain way, and harm is made possible. And I have to, end of quote, then I have to ask myself, is not such a body a Black body? Is the Black body, the ordinary Black body, is it able to be incorporated in American body politics, or can it at this moment only be incorporated through what one would call notable exceptions? So one of the questions I think all of this raises for us is to think about the present order, to think about the present order and its history, to think about whether or not, in fact, the Black body is not, in the American context, a perpetual enemy within the American body politic. And if it is a perpetual enemy within the American body politic, then our history may be really a history of war, truces, and settlement. Just a provocation. If this provocation has any meaning or has any merit, then people of goodwill and Black people have to think about a set of strategies, a set of actions to transform the American social system, one which actually thrives on a perpetual enemy. And in this case, that the perpetual enemy is that of the Black body. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Bogues. We'll now hear from Professor Seth Rockman.
Thank you so much for joining this conversation today. Thank you to Professor Rose and to Provost Locke for inviting me to participate in this event. I want to begin today with an acknowledgement of my colleagues participating in a scholar strike across the country yesterday and today to draw attention to the persistence of anti-Black racism in virtually every facet of American society. I'm hopeful that our conversation today will reflect our solidarity with the work taking place on campuses nationwide. So by way of introduction, I'm a historian of the economic past, and my research and teaching have focused on slavery's centrality to the emergence of modern capitalism, its institutional arrangements, its ideological presuppositions, and its ground level operations over the last 5 centuries. My courses and my scholarship in those spaces, I argue, as have many before me, that the road to a recognizably modern economy ran through what is today understood to be a crime against humanity lasting for hundreds of years. The trade in African bodies and crops produced by their coerced labor and the labor of their descendants mobilized unprecedented quantities of capital, generated new financial instruments, facilitated innovations in bookkeeping and management strategies, prompted advances in industrial technologies, and linked consumers and producers across great distances, promoting the commodity form and helping to cement the market as an arbiter of social relations. And yet always and consistently bringing forth the fact that market freedom and human freedom have not historically been mutually reinforcing. Slavery also produced new ideologies of human difference that travel under the label of race, and that established how markets have historically functioned, who has access to credit, and ultimately who works where, for whom, on what terms, and to whose benefit. In an earlier book I wrote about Baltimore in the era of Frederick Douglass, I was particularly interested in the way race structured the labor market in a city where enslaved people, like Douglass, sometimes earned wages, but where white people comprised the majority of the urban poor. I continue to focus on the ways that race has been mobilized under capitalism, and to historicize the ways that race, and specifically anti-Black racism, was produced and reproduced in the crucible of what I've called elsewhere slavery's capitalism. Now, one of the ways that I've tried to think about the production of anti-Black racism in America is to think somewhat expansively about the geography of slavery in the United States, and to focus on locations not in the South, and places where there were relatively few enslaved African and African-descended people. Departing from the false assumption of a free North and a slave South, I've come to study the economic entanglements between the so-called sections, and to think not only about the ways in which that the fruits of slavery flowed northward, long after northern states had abandoned slaveholding themselves, but to also think about the ways that northern locations functioned as the institutional and infrastructural supports for slaveholding that thrived thousands of miles away. To put this in more concrete terms, if one were thinking about the dependence of New England textile factories on slave-grown cotton in the era of the American Industrial Revolution, one might say that New England had offshored its slaveholding to reap the benefits of slavery at a safe distance from the actual buying, selling, beating, and abusing of actual enslaved people. And in turn, if one were to think about how the slaveholding states allocated their captive labor to prioritize commodity production above all else, and thus relied on remote locations to provide textile, shoes, and tools for the use of their enslaved workforce, one might say that the South had strategically outsourced the manufacture of these crucial supplies in the pursuit of profit. Now, asking these kinds of questions about these remote economic entanglements has been common at Brown for the last several decades as they inform the work of the Slavery and Justice Committee, and indeed are sort of borne witness to in the memorial to the victims of the transatlantic slave trade that sits on the quiet green, recognizing that Rhode Islanders profited within an Atlantic slave economy. So what I'd like to speak more about today is the way that anti-Black racism was produced in places like New England, precisely through these economic entanglements that by the 19th century increasingly tied lives and livelihoods in places like Rhode Island to the intensified exploitation of enslaved people in places like Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. It's important to acknowledge that I follow scholars such as Barbara and Karen Fields in conceptualizing racism as an ideological project that must be made and remade. Anti-Black racism has not been constant, but rather has a history and has been mobilized at different times in different ways to different ends to serve different political projects. Scholars focusing on the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the era of the American Revolution in the United States, the Haitian Revolution, and the so-called Enlightenment in Europe, have noted that as an increasing number of people declared freedom to be the normative condition of humanity, efforts would have to be redoubled to explain why some portion of society was in fact not entitled to that freedom, and as many scholars have come to argue, the urgent need to justify human bondage in societies predicated on liberty summoned into being ever more intensified explanations of human difference, or as we would put it, race and racism. These efforts were especially strong in the North in the first decades of the 19th century, where new kinds of scientific discourses about fixed biological difference, new communities of readers gathered within an exploding print culture of satire and caricature, new kinds of audiences for a robust popular culture of minstrelsy, allowed diverse European descended people greater license to gather under the umbrella of whiteness by creating new beliefs about African descended people as occupying a state of permanent and perpetual degradation. A caste, in Isabel Wilkerson's provocative recent formulation, a state of blackness. Now this happened in the very years of intensifying economic interconnection between North and South, and when particularly New Englanders were providing material supports to Southern slavery in the form of hats and hoes and shovels and shoes and textiles, goods which have been the subject of a book I'm nearly finished writing. Plantation goods, as these items were called, functioned as a vehicle for white Americans to produce what scholars have sometimes called racial knowledge, a set of assertions often conveyed as facts about Black people that substantiated white dominance. So conversations about Negro cloth, or about Kentucky axes, or about slave brogans, opened up a space for white people to talk about Black people, to consider the virtues of their enslavement and their capacities for freedom. Were Black people biologically different in such a way that their health required distinctive fabrics? Did Black people have the mental capacity to use tools without breaking them? Could Black people take care of their possessions responsibly in a way that would predict their success in freedom? So the manufacture in New England of these mundane goods for remote wearers and users allowed people who'd never seen a slave, or even many Black people at all, to come to be certain about the unbridgeable difference between Black and white, a practice that Karen and Barbara Fields have called Racecraft, a provocative term for the transformation of arbitrary markers of difference and ancestry into organizing structures of power in societies predicated on the reality of biological difference. One of the subtleties of this process of racecraft involved the capacity to racialize material objects, goods, so that people could recognize not just cloth, but Negro cloth. The application of the adjective Negro to a noun like cloth functioned in a quotidian way to educate a white public in the incontestability of racial difference. If race could adhere to something like a pair of pants or an axe after all, then who could deny its potency as an organizing principle of society more generally? The degraded race of the user racialized the object, and with predictable circularity, the degraded nature of the object, not a bed, but a Negro bed, not an axe, but a Negro axe, racialized the user. In the self-reinforcing logic of anti-Black racism, lower quality textiles that would have been familiar to working people throughout the Atlantic world became Negro cloth when Black people wore them. And in turn, the particular characteristics of that cloth, its color, its pattern, became useful to the dominant culture in designating and denigrating Black people as racially inferior. The interregional trade in hats and hoes and shovels and shoes was not exclusively an economic enterprise, but it did, as I've argued, contribute to a broader cultural project that put material culture in the service of a national discourse of Black inferiority. A continuous conversation moving across space and taking place in person and on the page allowed a wider segment of the white population to ultimately know the difference between Black people and themselves. In catalogs and advertisement, makers of plows and hoes became vendors of racial caricature and white supremacy. The presumptive deficiencies of Black workers undergirded every reference to tools adapted to the South that appeared in the advertising copy of a New York or Boston hardware dealer. The Northern agricultural press devoted itself to othering Southern agriculture as inefficient, but with the concurrent effect of othering Black people as racial subjects. This was ultimately, too, one of the ironies of abolitionist propaganda. Its creators deployed depictions of ragged slaves as a means of pursuing emancipation and in the broader agenda of racial equality, But when these depictions circulated to a larger public lacking those same investments, the image of the shivering slave or the immodestly covered child could function to mark Black Americans as hopelessly different by virtue of their decrepit material lives. Now, there's something ironic, well, maybe that's the wrong word, about New Englanders manufacturing the very goods that they would then utilize as proof of Black inferiority. Perhaps it's perverse, that's the word I'm looking for. This is akin to an observation that the literary scholar Robbie Richardson has recently made around the way in which 18th century British people constructed visions of Indian savagery around the tomahawks and scalping knives that they themselves, in fact, had produced and manufactured in British cities like Sheffield and Birmingham. The recognition of slavery as a geographically unbounded institution has been perhaps one of the most important recent transformations in how contemporary Americans have engaged their national past, as it has become clear that these hinterlands of the slave economy, places like Rhode Island, far removed from plantation zones, nonetheless provided crucial material support to a violent system of agricultural commodity production. And this was not lost on many 19th century commentators. Where will you draw the line? Where does slavery stop? Asked a New York City minister in 1858. He'd posed the question cynically as an effort to shush Northern abolitionists, but asking where slavery ended and freedom began was a familiar tactic for inserting moral questions into economic relationships. Anti-slavery activists in the 1790s had wanted every tea drinker in England to imagine their sweetened cups overrunning with the blood of slaves. 50 years later, a visitor to Liverpool and Manchester attributed the growth of these twin capitals of cotton manufacturing, quote, to the toil and suffering of the Negro, as if his hands had excavated their docks and fabricated their steam engines, end quote. In the tellingly titled Southern Wealth and Northern Profits, the author Thomas Prentice Kettle insisted that slavery was the nation's employer, generating a demand for goods that furnished work for European immigrants to New York and Boston. Quote, that they live at the North is the case, but they are nonetheless supported by Southern patronage, end quote. Another commentator called for a recalibration of national economic statistics, shifting a substantial portion of the working Northern class to the Southern column. Quote, every man at the North who makes a plow, a hoe, a shovel, or a cotton gin to aid the production of cotton should ultimately be counted as a hand engaged in that crop, end quote. So to wrap things up, I would argue that the history of anti-Black racism in America does not hinge upon the ways necessarily that New England workers imagined the enslaved wearers of their handiwork. But if we are interested in understanding racism as a set of beliefs that construct human difference and make reality out of ideology, then we need to consider the many different places where race has been historically made, and perhaps do so as a way for ourselves to be ever more attentive to the geographies of race making and anti-Black racism, perhaps particularly appropriate in the summer when we've spent most of our time talking about places like Minneapolis or Kenosha. And so in this light, to the seemingly innocuous places where economic entanglements created the opportunity to imagine and to likely erase people tied into a shared economic system, I think we have the opportunity to think similarly along the lengthy supply chains that have tied together producers and consumers across space and geographies, but also across the presumptive lines of race. Along those pathways, it's really not very difficult to lose sight of capitalism's impressive capacity to coordinate market production across great distances and across distinct regimes of labor. Yet it also requires a willful blindness to pretend that these processes of integration magically or bloodlessly created material abundance while inevitably and invariably pointing away from human bondage and the anti-Black racism that human bondage has created. We could start, for instance, with a celebration of the invisible hand, like the famous libertarian classic that Milton Friedman popularized, I Pencil. But we might be urged to consider the way in which the outcomes look different when we think through I shackle, or I whip, or I Negro cloth. Thank you so much for your attention today.
Thank you, Professor Rockman. And now we'll hear from Professor Emily Owens.
I want to begin by thanking my colleagues, Professor Bogues and Professor Rockman, for your really illuminating comments. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation that is to follow. my own comments. And I'd also like to begin by thanking Professor Rose and Provost Locke for convening this set of conversations around such a powerful idea, the race and framework. I think it's disarmingly simple because it succinctly highlights the clarifying and explanatory capacity of race in nearly every aspect of American society. I'm so glad to be a part of this conversation, and I'm so grateful to Professor Rose and Provost Locke for insisting that Brown University be a place where we can center the extent to which racism is among American society's most durable traditions. So this panel that we are a part of today about race and slavery is the only in this series as yet that references something that is situated distinctly in the past. Let me quickly qualify this and also to return to Professor Bogues' really lovely remarks about whether or not the past is ever past. But here I'm talking about slavery and referring to the transatlantic slave trade and later the American internal slave trade. My colleague Elena Shee, who is part of American Studies and Ethnic Studies and also a colleague at the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, has really brilliant things to say about the ways that slavery continues to work as a metaphor for thinking through contemporary problems. So here, though, I want to focus on the pastness for the duration of my comments. So if slavery is past, then today's conversation is, I think, an opportunity to think broadly about the uses of historical thinking in a moment like this. Why look backward in a moment when the present is so urgent, when we're living in what Robin D.G. Kelley has called the fire this time? Looking backwards tells us where we come from. That's frequently the way that historians and others think about the uses of the past. It's useful, we think, to tell us where we've been, to tell us that we've been here before. The past system, for example, that slaveholders in the 19th century US plantation South used to control enslaved people's movements on the roads between their plantations can be understood as the precursor or the antecedent to state-mandated curfews that many of us have undergone in the last several months in cities in revolt. They can be understood as antecedents to prison surveillance technologies. They can even be understood as the antecedent of hall pass systems that are typical in many primary schools. I think it's useful, it's quite plain, to see that the evolution of one thing evolves into another, and that it's useful to be able to see that progression. It's also incredibly demoralizing. The sense that history repeats itself is seemingly always available to us. But historical thinking isn't just about telling us where we came from. It's also about telling us where we are. I think sometimes it's easier to look outside, to look other, than it is to look inward or at ourselves. Sometimes it is easier to look through a window than it is to look in a mirror. As contemporary observers, we look at slaveholders as this class of others, and we tend to think of them as mostly evil or at the very least pretty delusional. But as historians, we know that while there was plenty of discourse in the early 19th century US about whether or not slavery was a good idea, most slaveholders, most of the time, didn't feel particularly guilty or deeply conflicted about the ways that they lived their lives, about the ways that slavery shaped their day-to-day lives. Nor were they an entire class of sadists or sociopaths. Slaveholders were ordinary people. And all the people who were imbricated with their slaveholding project, aspiring slaveholders, those who built ships or forged shackles or wove Negro cloth, as Professor Rockman was just mentioning, who endeavored to carry people across the Atlantic, those who financed those journeys or insured those journeys, they were ordinary too. Slaveholders and their many enablers, accomplices, and bystanders experienced slavery as ordinary. And so we should imagine or begin to help ourselves trick our minds into understanding their many violences as ordinary. Often people use words like dehumanizing or brutal or even inhumane to describe the history of slavery. But the historical reality suggests that holding other people in bondage for profit and committing violence at intimate levels and at scale is in fact a deeply human thing to do. Indeed, Walter Johnson has written, quote, exploitation and violence may well be definitive of human beings. And so what this means is that what sometimes looks, things that look to us like obvious, flagrant, awful, brutal violence might have looked to 19th century folks like the flowering of Christianity, like the promise of democratic governance, like the invisible hand, like the just use of punishment as a teaching tool, or the healthy rhythms of an American family. So the relevant question then is not loaded with moralizing incredulity. How did they do that? The question is much more open. I think it's much more curious. How did they do that? How? Slaveholders and their many accomplices lived within a network of ideas about who people were, about what bodies were for or what they could do, about what the land and the earth were for, about what God was and what government was. And those ideas loosely fit together. Those ideas made sense to the people who espoused them. And the logic wasn't airtight. In fact, that's part of what made it so powerful. It was flexible. It was nimble. So when we ask the question, how did they do that? How did they achieve the greatest accumulation of wealth the world had yet seen, as C.L.R. James wrote in the early 20th century? How? How did they stomach the severing of children from their parents? How did they believe the people they owned loved them, even needed them? How did they understand themselves to be making a free society? We see that the work of violence in answering these questions is ideological. The ways that violent behavior is articulated rarely as extraordinary. It's rarely looking for a justification. More often, violence is expressed as the thing that is sensible, as reasonable, sometimes comical, often pleasurable. If we acted like historians of the present, we might call ourselves to ask the same kinds of how questions. Looking in the mirror with the same energy of curiosity rather than incredulity, we might learn a bit more. We might see that the violence that we see around us is not so out there as it is in here. How is it possible? How? To compress someone's windpipe in the context of a routine police stop? How? To what extent is lethal violence routinized in American policing? Why is it illegal to sell loose cigarettes? Who wrote that law? What relationship does such a law have to the extinguished life of Eric Garner? How come the cops who killed Daniel Prude were grossed out when he vomited instead of worried? How? Why is being accused of sexual violence or admitting on camera that one has committed sexual assault not a disqualifying offense to holding public office? Is there any relationship between our ability to let that slide and the way that Breonna Taylor was understood as a threat while she was sleeping? Or maybe she wasn't a threat. Maybe she just deserved it. Is that like the way that women deserve to get grabbed by the pussy? Did she want it? This does make sense. There are answers to these questions. We have to stop being baffled and say that there are some out there, some others, who are incomprehensible to us. These are not the logics of some others. These are the logics of a society that we share. We know them. What are those logics? Can we recognize them? Can we allow ourselves to admit that we recognize them? The point then is that slaveholding made sense to slaveholders. Someday, historians will look at us and ask those same questions. How did they make such a world? Undoing racism begins with understanding how it works, how it is working, and how it is working for so many of us. One other note about the uses of the past and the uses of the particular history of American slavery. When we look at the history of enslaved people and formerly enslaved people, we see also alongside, in the midst of this history of violence, we see a history of radical resilience, of solidarity, of collaboration, and of survival. We see histories of deprivation in which, and in the face of deprivation, we see people joining with one another as opposed to fighting with one another. We see a history especially of vision, and we see a history of change. I started this talk by saying that transatlantic slavery is over. And that is because this history is also a story in which the Civil War actually happened and enslaved people actually walked off plantations. It is a story in which self-emancipated people took shackles, physical, material shackles, and put them in coffins and performed a funeral march down the middle of village streets and buried them in the ground, creating the first Memorial Day. When people talk about prison abolition or defunding the police, there's often a kind of charged response like, that's impossible. It's impossible for most of us to imagine a world without incarceration or policing. But until the movement to end slavery really got going in full force in the 1830s and 1840s in the United States, which is to say only after slavery had been happening in the Atlantic world for 350 years, only then did it become reasonable to think that a world without slavery could happen. The notion that no slavery was a workable economic or political or cultural path was understood to be incredible. The people who fought to end slavery had to convince people not only that the institution was terrible, which was not a very hard argument to make, but also that another world was possible, that slavery was not inevitable, that there could be something else to be. The people who broke the back of slavery engaged in a kind of imaginative work that sought past the world that existed into another world. It was a profound leap of faith that anti-slavery organizers, thinkers, and writers were up to. Imagining another reality, another horizon, was the work of anti-slavery. And when the movement for Black lives uses the language of abolition, they are signaling that history, a history of people who insisted that another world was possible and set about the work of creating it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily. Really appreciate that, and to Seth and Tony as well. So I'm going to ask a couple of sort of introductory questions to get us started. And I wanted to let everyone know who's joining us today that the question and answer area in the Zoom universe that we're occupying is open and available for questions and comments, and I will and others will curate that and make sure they are addressed as best we can. So I want to start, I'm just going to sort of start back at the beginning a little bit and see if I can draw a couple of threads and then ask a couple of questions and invite you all to speak across to each other as well in response to all of it. I was struck by Tony's use of the term fantasy, that race was in fact perhaps a structure of fantasy, and then Seth's invocation of racecraft, and then Emily's focus on sort of imagining, right? The notion of imagining freedom, justice, a vision of possibility at the same time. Can the three of you speak in whatever way you wish to both the intensity of the ways in which race has been imagined in destructive ways, but also the ways in which the same sort of effort to generate an imagination of ending it and creating a non-racist or a racially just environment requires similar types of sort of operations of creation, right? I mean, they're obviously opposites, but they're also at the same time relying on ways of being, ways of seeing, ways of imagining. And I'm just wondering if you can connect these things to each other and also to a little bit to today. I know we're in the past with slavery, but part of the intention was to sort of connect to where we are now, which you all so carefully did. So that's the opening inquiry. Tony, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, all right. Thanks, for sure. The question of trying to think about race as fantasy and kind of naturalized common sense really occurred to me as I began to think about race as an ideology, which is a standard kind of way of thinking through it. And then I began to ask myself the question, but that this is an ideology that morphs, as Seth says, that changes, but at its core is a certain kind of anti-Blackness. And and then I asked myself, given the long history of this thing, 300, almost 400 years, can we just still continue to call this ideology? Or is it not congealed into something else? And then when you begin to listen to the right wing and you begin to listen to white supremacy and their arguments and so on, you begin to realize no matter how much kind of argument you may make or how much kind of science you may have or anything, it doesn't cut it at all. And therefore, when that happens, that what you're really looking is a set of fantasies that has been created. And that you don't have and fantasy is not something you can explain to people and say you are fantasizing. And so it has a certain life, it has a certain material reality to it. So increasingly, I'm beginning to think that anti-Black racism might have begun as a set of ideologies and as an ideology, but over time, it has actually become a certain fantasy and is deployed politically as a fantasy by right-wing people and authoritarian populists. In response to that, so that's what I mean. I agree entirely with Emily, because one of the things I think about the present, and I've written extensively about this, that is to me absolutely amazing, is that you have had what I call the unleashing of a kind of Black imagination. That, in other words, where there is an explosion of people trying to, in protests and so on, trying to think through trying to imagine what does a future look like. But what is interesting to me is not what the future looks like tomorrow, but what does the future look like today? And to me, one of the most important words that has emerged is the one that Emily talked about. One of the most important political concepts. That's the concept of abolition. Abolition as a demand, not just to do with police defunding and so on, but abolition as a demand for a certain kind of different future, a different world today. And that to me is important, because what that signals is that, and as in all politics that thinks about something different, that you have to unleash the imagination. Because you can't think about a new world without not unleashing the imagination. Because the old world is part of the everyday, the quotidian. The new world is really brought into being first through the imagination. It's brought from, you look at every single protest, every single revolution in history where whoever has made it. It is the imagination that operates first, that opens up a space through which then people attempt to do certain things. They may fail, they may succeed, but this work of the imagination really becomes important. And I would then just want to argue, and this is that they find in literature that the fantasy is imaginative act, but it is an imaginative act that to me is works not so what works through much as through a certain kind of ideological beliefs that then becomes congealed, and what you have, the imagination has, is a seat of many things in us, but the imagination is what I like to call the radical imagination is what needs to be unleashed. But fantasy, to end by saying, I think fantasy is where we are in trying to think through. Where we are and trying to think through what anti-Black racism is.
I'd simply follow Tony by mentioning sort of the fundamental logic that I think informs a lot of critical historical work, which is, if we can take the categories that seem to organize the world and that seem to have organized the world perpetually from time immemorial, categories that appear to be natural or rooted in something larger than human society. What historians attempt to do is we attempt to denaturalize those categories. We attempt to historicize them by locating their production in particular and specific times and places, and to answer that question that Emily posed of how. All predicated on the idea that if we can see how something like anti-Black racism is made, we at least have certain tools at our disposal for that abolition project, for unmaking those structures that have limited our collective humanity. So it is, I think, something that is not just a political project, but in fact a disciplinary endeavor that binds many of us who work under the umbrella of history together.
I just wanted to expand briefly on something that Tony said early on about kind of ways of knowing. I think this question about the imaginative work of making race and making racism, and the imaginative work of unmaking race and unmaking racism, to me, invokes a question of ways of knowing, which is something that I've been thinking about a lot, particularly this summer, and witnessing the really entrenched polarization in our national conversation around race and racism, which is, I think, at base expressed as people living in different realities. And I think that I've come to understand that there's a world of discourse that I can't touch. I'm not touching it. And I don't have really any access to it. I understand the logics of the far right as conspiratorial, as rooted in a kind of emphatic non-empiricism, as being emphatically against the kinds of evidence that I hold really dear. And so I think that that's really important right now. If we're going to understand how logics are working, I think we have to take them seriously and try to understand not just, oh, that doesn't make sense in my logic, in my empirical world, but what it might mean that for someone that actually is a coherent logic. And I think that same kind of energy of imagining ways of knowing, different ways of knowing, and taking seriously different ways of knowing is the same kind of energy that allows us to begin to think about another world.
Right. Yes. Yes, definitely. Thank you. I have my own additional questions, but I'm going to put them in my pocket because we have a couple of questions from the audience. And so I'm going to ask a couple of these, and I'm not sure who the right person is for answering this, but I'll come up with someone when I'm done. All right. We have a question about the role of science and pseudoscience. And of course, we will talk about race and genetics later on in the series, but this question is as follows. We heard about the economic dependency on slavery and the synergistic relationship. Can you speak about how science or pseudoscience has validated racism and who has worked to eliminate racist scientific ideas? What scientific endeavors are happening in today's world that continue to perpetuate racist ideas?
That one, I don't want to answer the whole question, but I just would, I would call us to pause at the relationship between science and pseudoscience, because I think, to go back to what Seth just said about sort of what is the work that historians do, part of what we do is to say that what we think of now as pseudoscience was in 1850 absolutely science. It wasn't pseudoscience, it wasn't race science, it wasn't specialized science, it was just medicine. And so I think that to begin to open up a question about the way that race and racism is expressed through, is maintained through, is nurtured within fields of empirical study, like biological science or like medical science, is to take seriously the ways that it's not that the race stuff is wrong and everything else is okay, but rather that they're all enmeshed together in the same project, and that various kinds of theories get discredited over different periods of time and context. But that the binary between science and pseudoscience, I think, is we learn more if we just take it seriously as in the past as science, and try to understand why people took it really seriously then.
The only thing I would add to that is that the birth of science is coeval with the colonial and project of racial slavery. The business of trying to, some of the ways in which science emerged was through business of trying to talk about the natural world and explain the natural world, and then map that onto something called, and the natural history of man. And what is interesting is that at every moment when when people were trying to explain difference, and because of the colonial encounter, and trying to explain why is it that the folks in the New World or people of African descent were so quote unquote different, then you then deploy a certain kind of so-called scientific understanding. So when the people were writing like Montesquieu and so on, were writing about the business and that different natural history of man, one of the important things was the role of environment in this. And so people began to think about environment objectively, and how did they understand the environment in shaping the so-called natural history of man. When people began to think about questions of the brain and where the brain was located, etc., etc., and what then happened, and Emily is right, what then happened is that people begin to think of phrenology, begin to think about, okay, well, again, what is the difference between the African and the European? In other words, the point I'm trying to make is that there is a way in which science has always been deployed as a way to explain human difference. And in trying to explain human difference, it then maps itself upon a certain understanding of race. I think in thinking about the current period, one of the things that one might want to think about is, and you will discuss this, I'm sure, in health, in the health version next week, is how is it that medical science has shaped conceptions of Black people when it comes to questions of pain, when it comes to questions of what is the so-called common disease for Black people and what is not a common disease for Black people. So again, it is always, to me, it is always thinking about these things as not separate and apart from human relationships, as not separate and apart from the way that we as human beings make the society. And therefore what happens is that these things becomes implicated in this very structures and very discourses about about society itself.
Yeah, what you've just said there, Tony, and in connection with what Emily said at the start of this answer, I think is something we should all be mindful of, which is that, it's not as if knowledge simply develops over time and whatever's the latest is the least ideological. What we find instead is that we're just as pseudo-scientific as we ever were, and it's just about different things. And that awareness is really part of the critical analysis that's so important, and the kind of open-ended questions that Emily's asking us to deploy. Okay, we have another question. This one is, since the degradation of Black bodies is normalized and mundane, how might abolition/Afrofuturism threaten or denaturalize anti-Black violence? How might it lend ourselves to the creation of futures of Black liberation? One of the things that I thought, I'm just going to put a little piggyback on this question and to relate to what you said at the outset and see if this might combine to create a little more energy. When you talked about the provocation, right, being about seeing this as a war, and my gut instinct for that was, well, it's already being constructed as a war by racists. So how this becomes a productive thing for us to do, I'm not quite sure. I'm not sure I would stand in easy agreement with that as a productive matter, because it would make me wonder how we would be able to get to this person's question here, right? Which is to say, once we know that it is in the mundane category of this kind of violence and normalized degradation, how do these other imaginations, right, practices and imaginations, abolition as a practice and as an imagination, Afrofuturism as a practice and an imagination, actually work to denaturalize anti-Black violence? And by that, I mean, it changes the binary of Black-white, because now it's about anti-racist, regardless of one's own hierarchy in this ridiculous system. And it's a matter then of creating futures, not only of Black liberation, but of, one could dare argue, white liberation, because the chains of white supremacy are not, they don't discriminate. they inflict themselves on all of us.
Let me say, Tricia, I actually operate from the position that the question of liberation and transformation is always about all human beings. I begin from that position, and that in the United States, it is that the Black liberation is a matter that has to do with the transformation of this country on the basis of anti-racist and also therefore include white folks. But I also what I'm trying to think about and this is why I say it's just a provocation that may not have merit. What I'm trying to think about is a narrative that runs something like this. This is how the conventional narrative runs. That you have racial slavery, you have emancipation, you then have Jim Crow, then you, and I'm just being, brutally schematic here. And then you have, then what you have is fights for integration, and then, and civil rights. And then what you have now is that we need more equality and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Justice. And what strikes me is that what happens if the black person is actually considered an enemy, right? Which the right does. But what happens if, in fact, lots of other people, the way in which society is structured, is that somehow this particular body cannot be incorporated fully. Some people can, right? Some notable, so what I call the notable exceptions. But as a whole, that the ordinary black person, men, women, cannot be. Which is how because then you have to explain to me to think about the carceral state and why so many black men and increasingly black women are now in prison. Then you have to think about the various wars on drugs, the ways in which criminalization of black men and women happen and so on. So that I'm trying to think through is there a way in which that anti-black racism has really constructed, given American society, a society which has to really work, which seems historically to work through all ways and some kind of hidden enemy, has to have some thrives on paranoia and conspiracies and so on. And Richard Hofstadter and others have talked, have written up extensively about this. Mm-hmm. So that is there a way in which, therefore, to think about this as war is to actually understand the violence that is both the quotidian and the quote unquote spectacular violence is really about really about treating an enemy and trying to tame that person.
Right. But who's the enemy in this formulation, Tony?
The enemy becomes a black person.
Right. Well, that's true. We already know that. But for black people, does it benefit black people is my question, to imagine that we're in a war ourselves. Yes. That's where I was wondering where you were going.
Because then my argument then is that if then you are in a war, then you have to begin to think, in my view, strategically about allies. You have to begin to think about how you dismantle state formations. You have to begin to think about how do you actually, what are the kind of actions that you want to, that you need to engage in. And you have to also begin to think about ways in which you can transform the society. And in my view, therefore, it is not about, it is not a nihilistic position. It's not a position that says there's no possibility. It is saying if we shift the analytics, does that open up another set of space for black politics that will allow us to think through a set of strategy and a set of tactics that will mean overcoming the kind of conditions, overcoming the conditions that we are in.
I see. Okay.
That is all I'm arguing, because
it's helpful. It's helpful to get clarification on that, because it was, you had a limited time, which I created your limitation. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to further explain, because, there are some worries about what it means to be further entrenched in a state of war in one's psyche when the war itself is going on for so long. But okay, we can come back to that if we need to. But I have a question for Seth Rockman, and then I have one for you, Emily. So Seth, from one of our attendees, is asking the following. In the past, I've been taught in high school that there was a line between the North and the South, where the North was good and the South was bad when it came to slavery and actions in the slave trade. Today, your presentation shows that that line is hazy, if non-existent. it's interesting to think about how Northern factories, for example, were accomplices. How do we work toward a history where we don't draw lines so that we can better understand race and the formation of race? So how do we more generalize, right, into the national, international consciousness, the blurred boundaries that you presented?
No, this is a moment that we are particularly well poised to tackle this exact thing. And that's because in our contemporary American lives as consumers, we spend a lot of time thinking about the ways in which the choices that we make, whether we fill up our SUV with gas, whether we purchase unfair trade coffee, whether we purchase clothing from H&M that's been made by sweatshop labor in Bangladesh, whatever it might be, the way in which our consumer choices have repercussions thousands of miles away and structure the experiences of people who we may never see and never know. And so this is about the rare earth minerals in your iPhone, on and on and on. And as we've come to a moment when I think we are having a fairly robust conversation about these entanglements in the present, it positions us incredibly well to think about those entanglements in the past and to recognize the ways in which those lines of geography or lines of that differentiate different kinds of modes of production are actually very, very blurry. And this is a space where then moving between the past and the present gives us the positionality to recognize that that globalization didn't begin in 1993, that these entanglements aren't a product of the last 20 years of neoliberalism, but these are in fact the conditions of global engagement and integration of the last 500 years. And this then gives us the possibility to think about new kinds of solidarities that might emerge across these lines that open up new political possibilities.
And to your excellent list of examples, right, of, the crystals in our iPhone and so on, I would put the, unpaid imprisoned labor used to fight fires, right, used to sew clothing and make license plates, etc. And then, of course, when they come out of prison, right, they're actually barred from any training programs to continue the labor in a way that would be paid. I'm just adding it back to the racial domestic context, but the global is incredibly important there. Thank you, Seth. Okay, Emily, we got one for you. Well, I've decided it's for you. It says, white women were active participants in slavery, shoring up their own economic power through ownership of the enslaved. How do you explain the role of bystanders to slavery and bystanders to extreme forms of thought like white women who were largely responsible to someone like Trump getting elected? Is their own fear and assurance, is it their own fear and assurance of economic power? Is it about social standing?
I think that the framework of bystanders in white women is a really interesting one, because I think white women certainly were bystanders to slaveholding, but they were also really active participants in 19th century US slavery and were, I think that the more interesting thing than them being bystanders was the ways that ideologies about white femininity imagined them as bystanders. Mm-hmm. And so the capacity of white women to be ladies, to keep households that were, materially intact and beautiful, was completely enmeshed with the capacity of those same women to hit and beat and kick and sexually violate the enslaved people who worked in their households. And so I think that there's a lot of work around hiding that is part of the ideology of white supremacy. And in fact, I would call like the twin ideologies of white supremacy and misogyny. And so I think that the same ideological sort of structures that propped up white women into positions of moderate power in the context of the plantation South or of the 19th century US are also the things that kind of kept them constrained. And that's a really complex position to be in. And I think that, toward the end of my remarks, I said something about how the history of US slavery shows us how in conditions of deprivation, people banded together. That's true. At extraordinary risk, right? Enslaved people, shared food and stole items that could keep them alive, and occasionally banded together in acts of sort of large-scale revolt. But I think we do ourselves a disservice when we don't realize that conditions of deprivation or oppression also can cultivate self-interest and survival strategies that are rooted in a sense of sort of mutual exclusivity or lack of abundance of resources. And so, yeah, I think that the position of white women in households in the 19th century US is maybe an expression of kind of getting what you can, getting the power that you have accessible to you. In the context of the contemporary sort of election moment and the last election cycle and the really crucial part that wealthy white women played in electing Donald Trump, I think that I worry about the ways that women in general across racial groups in moments of political conflict become scapegoats for political problems. So I would be hesitant about naming white supremacist women as the singular problem or the most important problem to focus on in this context. I do think that we are seeing in this moment a profound cleavage between feminisms that are racially unmarked as white and feminist practices that really center anti-racist, anti-imperial practices. But I don't think that's the sticking point that's going to get us through the next election.
So we're getting near the end, and there are a couple things I wanted to make sure we got to. And one is the current sort of moment around the 1619 project, which was designed by Nicole Hannah Jones. And the project itself, you know, was significant for its effort to sort of begin the conversation about this sort of starting of the Republic with 1619 is the first moment where an enslaved person is cargo, as I understand it. But what I'm really interested in is not only the fact that this was a wildly popular journalistic enterprise, which seems a little bit to go against what I would have expected. I could have imagined it as a boutique pleasure, but it had widespread interest. But most importantly, the curriculum that was developed by the New York Times to be spread and shared for free with public schools and any other schools who want it has now been threatened to be the source of a ban if they use it, threatened by President Trump. So in this past few days, he's threatened to withhold Department of Education money to any school that uses this curriculum. Can any of you speak to the importance of how we tell the story of slavery, how we've historically told it, what we've not said, how these kinds of curriculum, what role they might play in transforming and dislodging these rigid historical hierarchies, and in fact, you know, invite different collaborations, different connections and new alliances?
The historian Nathan Huggins wrote in one of his wonderful articles, The Deforming Mirror of Truth, when he said that Americans typically want to tell their history as Pilgrim's Progress, as a story on a road to salvation and deliverance, when in fact it might more effectively be told as Sartre's No Exit. And it turns out that the narrative arc of a nation's history does profoundly important work for naming the political project that presumably links people together as citizens and positions them in the globe. We've told an American history that has been fundamentally wrong for hundreds of years now, actually since the immediate aftermath of the American Revolution itself. And it seems appropriate that we tell a better and different history, a more honest history that gives American citizens a wider scope for imagining themselves embedded in the world and embedded in structures of inequality, oppression, and particularly in anti-Black racism. This is urgent, and it's not surprising that there's been so much pushback from the right. It's not surprising that our president declares that, you know, they're trying to change our history. I mean, that's such an amazing statement. They're trying to change our history. But of course, his you know, claims are completely wrong, and not to mention illegal. You can't, from the federal government standpoint, defund local curricula, curricular decisions made by local school boards. So, you know, whatever, they can talk all day. But the fact of the matter is, I'm so pleased with what the 1619 Project has done, and even recognizing that there are limitations, that if we told the history from a broader hemispheric perspective, 1619 would not be the starting day. From the perspective of a broader African diaspora in the Americas, the story begins much earlier. The 1619's engagement or disengagement with settler colonialism and native land expropriation is worth identifying. But as a fundamental reconceptualization of a US history, I think this project is spot on.
So
No,
go ahead, Tony.
I agree entirely with Seth, and I think that what you are looking at is that if you get the history right, in the sense of beginning to tell a different story, and more complete, not the complete, but a more complete story of American history, then the country has to confront racial legacies.
Right.
Simple. But if you operate from the position that there's no systemic racism in America today, which is the position that's coming out of the Department of Justice and therefore out of the president, this particular regime, is that this doesn't have to happen, and this is just more trouble, and it's quote unquote part of the culture wars and so on. So the real question is that the real issue is that how is as a political one, we don't need to discuss the actual history of the country and racial slavery, because there's no racism today.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Yeah, that's the logic. Right. Okay. Thank you, Tony. Emily? Sure.
I would just say that the attempt to really, I think, create a lot of bombast around the 1619 Project, and to express and perhaps imagine into reality the power of the federal government to control local curricula, is really about the uses and misuses of history. And there's a wonderful book that's been written quite recently by Jean Pio Harris about the civil rights movement. I think there are really similar things happening with the history of slavery and with the history of the civil rights movement, in that there are ways that these get packaged into a kind of sanitized national narrative in which there are heroes and there are villains, and none of us are complicit. And we can all understand ourselves to be pure at the end of the progress narrative. And so I think that the work of 1619 is to disrupt that and to ask us to imagine, to look anew at this history, and to understand ourselves within it. But the other piece, I think, comes down to the phrase Black Lives Matter, which is, I think, like a pretty straightforward, simple articulation. And it has become so explosive because it calls the bluff on our imagined post-racial society. And I think the extent to which people have flailed and freaked out at the phrase Black Lives Matter is a way that the movement has done a really excellent job of calling attention to the pretending and the hiding and the sanitizing that we routinely do as part of our national conversation around race.
I'm really grateful to the three of you for joining us today. This was a really fantastic conversation, and I'm thrilled that so many people had questions and that you all stayed this long. There's still close to 300 people here with us. So I really want to thank the three of you again, and hopefully we'll be able to have more. I mean, slavery in an hour and a half doesn't seem appropriate, but we do what we can do. And I just want to make sure everyone who's joined us is also thanked. Thank you very much for being a part of this, and join us again October 7th for the Race and Public Health in America series at the same time as we started today. So thank you everyone for being a part of it, and thank you to our panelists. If you're into all that, using the screen to put your hands up and thumbs up, let's give them all a big thumbs up. Thank you all very much and have a good afternoon.